We often talk about mountains as being conquered. But whenever I've climbed a mountain path, it's been a struggle because I've been aware, sooner or later, of two very conflicting feelings. And I expect most of you have felt those too. In the first place, certainly a simple-minded terror of falling off the path. But then there's the great exhilaration, almost a sense of exaltation in high places. So it's not surprising, really, if mountain stories and legends and myths have the same deep ambivalence. One author called them erupted carbuncles on the face of the earth. Yet another author could speak about mountains as being cathedrals of the earth. So conquering mountains may be a quest for the sublime. It may be a place where you're supposed to be able to see and apprehend and understand everything, take in the whole world at a glance. But the problem is the journey can take you right over the top.
Rapidly taking shape in the Black Hills of South Dakota is the Mount Rushmore National Memorial, to be composed of colossal figures of Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Theodore Roosevelt carved in stone. It's a man-sized undertaking, and before the sculptor can go to work, drillers prepare to blast the granite with dynamite to form the rough outlines of the carving. Hanging from the top in bosun's chairs, Gutzon Borglum, the sculptor, and his son go over the 60-foot Washington face, taking measurements to see that it is properly proportioned. The mountain is about 40 million years old, and the surface is worn away less than an inch each year, so that this great monument will last through the ages. An inspiring tribute to America's immortal.
For a while, in 1936, it looked as though there would be a woman's head on Mount Rushmore. After all, Susan B. Anthony, the 19th century feminist, had been a president too. But as president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, hardly the kind of president the sculptor of Mount Rushmore, Gutzon Borglum, had in mind. So although her face appears on a Susan B. Anthony dollar coin, Mount Rushmore remains a monument of males. The monument in the Black Hills was not meant simply as a gallery of immortals. Nor were the heads there to embody in some sort of wishy-washy way the spirit of democracy. No, what he had in mind was territory. The idea was to celebrate the possession and occupation of the entire American continent, with a group of colossi sitting at its dead center. So Jefferson is there, facing west, not because he was the principal author of the Declaration of Independence, but because he trebled the size of the Republic with the Louisiana Purchase. Roosevelt was there for acquiring the Panama Canal. Borglum's whole concept of Mount Rushmore, of the American Republic itself, was as the ultimate feat of tough guy, cliff face, masculine heroics. So, to his way of thinking, a woman in the club of male rulers would have been a shocking anomaly. Susan B. Anthony died in 1906, but she had created a militant generation that followed her in their thousands. And finally, in 1919, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was passed, giving women the vote. In the 1920s and 30s, a whole cohort of fiercely independent women, aviators like Blanche Scott and Amelia Earhart, writers like Edith Wharton and Dorothy Parker, and in the end, an energetic First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, all recognized the debt they owed to Susan B. Anthony and the founding generation of suffragists. And no one was more passionate in her devotion and gratitude than Rose Arnold Powell, an employee of the Internal Revenue Service in Minnesota and secretary and treasurer of the Susan B. Anthony Foundation. Rose Powell could imagine no better way of affirming the debt owed by all Americans to Susan Anthony than to have her angular features up there on the granite of the Black Hills of Dakota, along with Presidents Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Theodore Roosevelt. Why, she reasoned, Miss Anthony's firm jawline might have been made for granite. Still, at the outset, she later confessed, like Moses, I felt utterly inadequate for the undertaking. In March 1934, Miss Rose Arnold Powell wrote to Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt.
I protest with all my being against the exclusion of a woman from the Mount Rushmore group of great Americans. Future generations will ask why she was left out of the memorial if the greatness of this blunder is not rectified.
Borglum wrote in exasperation,
There is no place among the four great heads for her. She had no part in the creation of the Republic, nor its territorial development. I want you, however, to be assured that no one has a greater respect or honors more mothers and sisters than I, and the better half of our race will receive all the appreciated recognition I am capable of.
To the end of her days, Rose Powell would not give up, even petitioning Vice President Richard Nixon before she died. The trouble, though, was that for all her obvious sincerity, in Borglum, she ran slap up against someone who was not only not committed to her kind of feminism, but whose whole life was one long glorification of masculinity. Borglum's first try at mountain carving was of a piece with his passion for heroes. In 1914, a group of Confederate enthusiasts in Atlanta had proposed a 70-foot-high head of Robert E. Lee, carved into the 1,700-foot-high Stone Mountain. He taught them into a different work, a relief cut into the rock face of Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and the President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis. But Stone Mountain wasn't just any old hill. In 1915, it was the site of the modern re-establishment of the Ku Klux Klan. Borglum himself became a member of the Klan and remained a member while he was carving Mount Rushmore. The Klan liked to call itself the Invisible Empire. But Borglum's mission was to make the heroes of the American Empire extremely visible for 60 miles. The whole thing was conceived as Custer's revenge. 4 immense white faces staring down from a dynamited Indian burial site. So instead of triumphal heads of the real victors at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, the lodge of the Lakota spirits was demolished by the drilling bit, and the gods of earth and sky shoved aside to make room for Teddy Roosevelt's spectacles. And just because the monument was made in a democracy shouldn't blind us to the fact that this was a perfect project for the 1930s, a time when art as the work of Superman was in vogue elsewhere. No wonder then that Borglum's idea of a truly great ruler was Benito Mussolini. There's no doubt that, like Mussolini, Borglum thought of himself in some way perpetuating the imperial colossi of antiquity. And there was a very specific source that Borglum may well have had in mind when he conceived his mountain men. It was the legendary account of the first of the seriously big-thinking sculptor-architects, Dinocrates. It's the Roman architect Vitruvius who gives us the best version of the story, partly, I think, because he saw in young Dinocrates the prototype of the cocky, can-do, know-it-all architect. And why not? He's got the smarts, he's got the letter of recommendation, and he's a native son of Macedonia. So into the camp of Alexander the Great, Dinocrates marches, only to be fobbed off time and again by courtiers and underlings. Smarting with vexation, Dinocrates decides to gamble everything on a shamelessly theatrical self-promotion, designed to appeal to Alexander's notorious weakness for young, good-looking heroes. After all, he has something to show the great man other than his plans, his body. So he goes back to his inn, strips, oils his torso, top to bottom, throws a lion skin over his left shoulder, don't ask where he got one, and carries a great wooden club. Thus got up as Hercules, he makes sure he catches the king's eye. Once admitted to the king's presence, Dinocrates loses no time in describing his plan to carve the entirety of Mount Athos into the figure of the helmeted king. And unlike Mount Rushmore, the Alexander Mountain was going to be a choice address. A whole city would nestle beneath Alexander's left hand, while on his right would be the reservoir to collect the water for its needs. Nice thinking, Alexander responds, but what do they do for food? Well, how about shipping it in, says Dinocrates. Good try, says the king, but I think not. Still, I do like young men with big ideas. Dinocrates gets hired and is next heard of on the planning team building the port city of Alexandria. Through the generations, there have been others who've responded to Dinocrates' unfulfilled ambition to turn whole mountains into a celebration of the omnipotence of man. Michelangelo, for example, wanted to carve a colossus directly into the towering cliffs of Carrara from where he quarried his marble. Perhaps a Goliath to match his David. What we've got here in the Man Mountain tradition is surely the most outrageous, the most extreme case of humanity lording it over nature. A monstrous alteration of scale to make man the hero, truly lord of all he surveys. Mountains are still conventionally described as conquered, as if climbing them were some sort of military campaign against a dogged, unmoving enemy, properly subjected to our will only when we have their head beneath our feet, our crampons and picks stuck on their body. There's another story to be told, though, about our relationship to the high places of the world. For every Dinocrates, there's been a hermit or a holy man perched on a peak. And for every Borglum, there have been vertical pilgrims who have climbed the heights not to dominate them, but to be dominated. The reward in getting to the top turns out not to be a vision of the mountainous self-importance of humanity, but the opposite, insect-like insignificance, measured against the awesomeness of geological time. In classical China, emperors were quite capable of shearing off the sides of mountains to inscribe huge written graffiti celebrating their wisdom and power. But there was also a 2,000-year-old Taoist tradition in which sacred mountains were conceived as cosmic pillars or connecting rods between the abodes of mortals and immortals. High on their slopes, guarded by dragons and tigers, dwelled shamans, holy men who denied the world, concocted magic elixirs from mountain herbs, and who, in a state of lofty exaltation, could penetrate the deepest mysteries of the universe. their meditations were thought of as akin to an arduous climb, shedding the earth and reaching for the celestial. So when court artists painted emperors making obligatory pilgrimages to the holy mountains, they were required to paint bottom to top, with the extraordinary hills stylized like the coils of a writhing dragon. In the Christian tradition, the mountain was also a place where lessons of humility and self-effacement were supposed to be learned. Christ, after all, had rejected Satan's temptation to survey and possess the kingdoms of this world. And the most pious world-rejecting saints and hermits built their cells in the most remote and rockiest hilltops. There they could commune with the celestial and do battle with the demons and dragons supposed to be lurking in caves and crevices. When European artists began to paint holy mountains, they presented them as fantastic, stalactite-like columns of rock, reaching from the earth to the terrestrial paradise, the waiting room to heaven, a high-altitude Shangri-La where brooks babbled and fleecy lambs ran around in the clouds. In the late medieval mind, mountains, with their feet on the earth and their face veiled in cloud, were mysterious borderlands between the physical and the spiritual worlds. But suppose you were actually to climb one. The first account we have of what seems to have been a real mountain climb is in a long letter written by the great 14th century Italian poet Petrarch to a friend who was also a cleric. Not surprisingly then, the experience of the ascent of Mont Ventoux in southeastern France begins with matter-of-fact, earthy things, but it ends up on the high slopes of the soul. Petrarch, who took his young brother with him, wanted to see if he could make out a view of both Italy and Spain from the top. But the way up is barred by all sorts of choices that increasingly become moral rather than just physical. His brother opts for the hard route straight up, but Petrarch himself for the indirect, winding procrastinator's circuit. And the view he will ultimately get from the summit will not so much be a panorama of the world, but the landscape of his own soul. When he gets to the top, he lets his homesick mind drift towards Italy and towards his lost mistress, Laura. But as if to thrust away these earthly visions, the temptations of Satan, he opens his copy of St. Augustine's Confessions and, surprise, surprise, it falls open at the following passage. And men go about admiring the high mountains, and the mighty waves of the sea, and the wide sweep of the rivers, and the circuit of the oceans, and the revolution of the stars, but themselves they consider not. Rather like a naughty boy told to come down from a tree at once, Petrarch descends the mountain in the light of the setting sun. How many times, think you, he writes to his friend, did I turn back that day to glance at the summit of the mountain, which seemed but a cubit high compared with the range of human contemplation when it is not sunk in the foul mire of the earth. Most holy scramblers didn't have Petrarch's anxieties about the presumptuousness of climbing. They worked their way up slopes to try and share the experience of the Saviour suffering on Calvary. The harder the climb, the more they could shake off the vanities of this world and the cares of the flesh, and discover the airy lightness of the soul close to heaven. At the same time as pious Catholics were imagining mountains as the landscape of sacred apparitions, other Renaissance Europeans were naturalizing mountain scenery, attempting for the first time to suggest it might actually be pleasing to the eye, even exciting to the senses. Painters like the German Albrecht Dürer and the Fleming Peter Brechel, who actually travelled the long, footsore route over the Alpine passes, produced sketches that anchored the mountains more firmly to the conventional geography of the Earth. The even temper of these sketches and drawings suggests an attitude to altitude no longer governed by the expectation of miracle. Whether they could safely come and go, of course, was another matter, and the Neapolitan artist Salvatore Rosa made an entire career by exploiting a continuing nervousness about walls of rock. If the crags were no longer home to demons and dragons, they were still the lair of brigands, and in his most dramatic numbers, Rosa became the virtuoso of mountain fright scenes, distorting scale and depth to give the beholder a bad case of two-dimensional vertigo. The word most often used in connection with Rosa by the English aristocrats who collected him so avidly was terribilitar, which we should really translate as the thrill of the scary, roller coaster heights and depths. But pure sensationalism was not enough. There was a growing demand for scientific explanation of the prehistoric origin of mountains. And it was one of the most influential and wrong-headed books ever written, The Sacred Theory of the Earth by the Cambridge theology don Thomas Burnet, that brought science and epic drama together. The problem for all good-believing Christians was, how could God come up with anything so frightful and so ugly as mountains? Burnet had the answer. The original Earth, as created, had actually been as smooth and featureless as a billiard ball. The primordial egg was what he called it. It was only when God punished mankind for its transgressions with the flood that a great abyss opened up, crumpling its spherical perfection into great wrinkles, crusts, and eruptions. According to Burnet, the mountains of the world were the congealed ruins of the greatest of all prehistoric dramas, the geological dinosaurs that had petrified their own origins in flame and flood. Delightful horror was the way one 18th century mountain tourist described the sensation of making his way through this landscape of convulsion. The 18th century, though, was the time when reasonable men looked for reasonable explanations of natural phenomena. It was in the 18th century, for example, that the old name for the mountain that soared over the western end of the Alps, Mont Maudit, the Cursed Mount, was changed to Mont Blanc. And the possibility that mountain ranges had not been caused by one immense cataclysm, as Burnet had thought, but had occurred regularly from volcanic eruptions over eons of time, spurred scientists to plan actual ascents so that they could collect evidence that would provide a more reliable age for the Earth than the 4,000 years decreed by the churchmen. The first generation to climb daunting peaks like Mont Blanc were less romantics, sampling the sublime, than measurers, wanting to establish the relative scale of things natural and things human. One of the earliest climbers to reach the summit of Mont Blanc was a Genevan scientist, Horace Benedict de Saussure, who reported his climb in an account that aimed at a perfect blend of science and sensibility. Saussure was too truthful a reporter, though, to describe his own ascent as if it were a pure triumph of scientific skill and human will. Above 7,000 feet, the human apparatus of his perception began to break down. He felt trapped between terrible spasms of sleep and hyperactivity. Great waves of nausea engulfed him. His pulse raced, his lungs seemed pierced by splinters of dry ice. His reason, in fact, seemed impaled on the peak. Instead of the view from the summit being one of lofty, unobscured clarity, it often swam with a kind of disorientation that poets like Shelley, who climbed to the glacier of Mont Blanc, described as a sentiment of ecstatic wonder not unallied to madness. Arguably, the greatest of all mountain painters, John Robert Cousins, did fall into insanity on returning from alpine trips where he'd painted the peaks mantled with a kind of trance-like hallucinatory stillness, a vision really of someone whose conventions of scale and space had been suspended by altitude. It was John Robert Cousins' painting of Hannibal crossing the Alps, now alas lost, that Turner said was his inspiration for this astonishing painting, surely the ultimate retort to human mountain mastery. The year was 1812, and though Turner could not yet have known of the disaster that had befallen Napoleon's Grand Army in the Russian snows, he was enough of a passionate patriot to want it. So he provided his own corrective to Napoleon's presumption in casting himself as the new Hannibal crossing the St. Bernard Pass to conquer Italy. Like some vengeful sorcerer, Turner summons the fury of the elements to build into a vast, destroying snowstorm that hovers over Hannibal's army like a monstrous bird of prey. And instead of the general as Superman mountaineer, Turner miniaturizes Hannibal to the scale of an insect astride a micro-elephant, helplessly lost in the howling eye of the storm. Turner's self-appointed champion, John Ruskin, extolled what he called mountain glory as the beginning and end of all scenery. For Ruskin, geological knowledge and religious reverence were not at all irreconcilable. The more one knew, and above all, the more closely one observed the marvel of geological formation, whether in a single boulder or the entire Matterhorn, it was the miraculous intricacy and curved irregularity of mountain forms, the sense of a petrified ruin that testified to the ultimately mysterious genius of the Creator. The holier the sanctuary, of course, the more profane the desecration. Ruskin grieved and raged against the Alps becoming a playground of climbers and tourists. You have made racecourses of the cathedrals of the earth. Your one conception of pleasure is to drive in railroad carriages around their aisles and eat off their altars. The Alps themselves, which your poets used to love so reverently, you look on as soaped poles in a bear garden, which you set yourselves to climb and slide down again with shrieks of delight. And when you are past shrieking, having no human articulate voice to say you are glad with, You fill the quietude of their valleys with gunpowder blasts and rush home red with conceit and voluble with convulsive hiccups of self-satisfaction. A bit over the top, yes, but then Ruskin saw himself as a righteous prophet, defending the sanctuary of God against the legions of desecrators. Sportsmen, climbers, catchpenny heroes of the vertical empire, sticking flags and banners into every peak that they imagine presented a challenge to their national and individual egos. Climbers he hated most of all for their pretension to elite knowledge of the mountain. Flattened against the rock wall with your nose to the granite was no way to see, much less understand, the mountain glory. For their part, most climbers don't think much of Ruskin, who hurled his brickbats at them from the lower slopes and passes. And it's true that Ruskin's pessimism that climbing and reverence were mutually exclusive, that modernity and mountain passion were mutually exclusive, led him to caricature mountaineers as brainless Philistines. But while there were certainly some who were hell-bent on the conquest of the peaks, there were many others for whom it represented a moment of illumination they could find nowhere else. Even someone like George Mallory, canonized after his death on Everest in 1925 as the paragon of British gentleman scholar hero, saw right through the romance of mountaineering. He often seemed to want the mountain, not the mountaineer, to prevail. It's true, Mallory confessed, he had done his damnedest to climb Everest in 1922, but, he wrote shortly afterwards, "Now as I look back and see all those wonderful preparations, the train of animals and coolies carrying our baggage across Tibet, the 13 selected Europeans so snugly wrapped in their woolen waistcoats and Jaeger pants, their armour of windproof materials, their splendid overcoats, the 60 strong porters with them, delighting in underwear from England and leather jerkins and puttees from Kashmir, and then the unforgettable scene, the scatter of our stores at the base camp, the innumerable neatly made wooden boxes concealing the rows and rows of tins of Harris sausages, Hunter's hams, Heinz spaghetti, sardines, sliced bacon, peas, beans, gay tins of sweet biscuits, ginger nuts, rich mixed, and lastly, when I call to mind the whole begoggled crowd moving with slow deliberation over the snow, how can I help rejoicing in the yet undimmed glory, the unconquered supremacy of Mount Everest? Portrayed by his worshippers as the ideal male type, it was the blustering masculinity of the expeditions that Mallory found so offensive, especially when compared with the mute stoicism he attributed to the mountain. For Mallory, the mountain was the epitome not of subjection, but of stony resistance to human domination. Perhaps Mallory, with his belated doubts about mountaineering as an exercise in imperial campaigning, would have been drawn to the approach of a free climber like the Frenchwoman Catherine d'Estivelle, an altogether more direct and individual act. Catherine d'Estivelle climbs without the support of equipment or ropes or even the company of other climbers. Her body must shape itself to the rock or the consequences can be disastrous. From the beginning of women's climbing in the 19th century, there was always a daring sense of engagement, even union, between their bodies and the rock face. While men on the mountain reaffirmed cliches about the toughness of their physique, women on the mountains dramatically refuted the cliches about their physique, about the supposed limitations that might disqualify them from the supremely male domain. For the 44-year-old Henriette d'Angeville, who climbed Mont Blanc in 1838, it was evident that the ascent meant a kind of consummation of desire rather than a campaign of subjection. In her journal before the climb, she referred to the mountain as mon amant gelé, my frozen lover. Here she is in the full glory of her specially designed costume, all 21 pounds of it, from the tartan plaid stockings and peg-top fleece-lined trousers to her black feather boa, fur-lined cuffs and bonnet from which a sheer green silk veil hung. And underneath all this, there was English flannel, French silk, cucumber cream for the skin, and a black velvet mask against snow blindness. Fuming while bad weather held her up in Geneva, she wrote that she was
late for my wedding with the face of Israel, for the delicious hour when I could lie on his summit. Oh, when will it come?
And when it did come, she felt the same physical response. On her return to Chamonix, Henriette was feted as the Queen of the Alps. But her triumph was bittersweet, since none of her own friends or family seemed to be able to rise above their peak, that she'd ignored their advice not to proceed with the harebrained plan.
Supposing, I said to myself, an avalanche had swept me away into the abysses of Mont Blanc. My courage in facing danger would have been as great, but the general opinion would have been summed up in one declaration: the foolish woman.
Acutely conscious that she'd experienced the mountain in some different sense from men, Henriette went out of her way to invite to the celebration dinner the peasant woman, Marie Paradis, who 30 years before had been the first woman to scale a peak. Though at dinner, Marie Paradis was plainly the worse for wear from too much wine, Henriette treated her with a cordial tenderness due to someone she called a sister in Mont Blanc. For she seemed to know, in a way, what perhaps Rose Arnold Powell and even Susan B. Anthony might have understood: that if one were to follow a famous naturalist's command and think like a mountain, one would end up somehow thinking like a woman.
Go beyond the velvet rope of our most beautiful historic homes and meet the people saving our priceless heritage. Hidden Treasures of the National Trust on BBC iPlayer.